aggression against Ukraine. We reiterate our unconditional support for the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within internationally recognized borders. The findings from your latest report continue to testify on recurring violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. The accountability for the crimes committed, resulting in devastating suffering, must be ensured that all efforts taken towards ending the practice of impunity. In that vein, we emphasize the importance of timely and effective investigation and prosecutions of all atrocities. Croatia supports the efforts of the Ukraine government and international and regional accountability mechanisms aimed at documenting, investigating and prosecuting alleged crimes committed by the Russian Federation. We especially condemn illegal transfer and deportation of population outside of Ukraine borders, in particular children, which constitutes serious violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention. We encourage more information on circumstances related to the forced transfers and unlawful deportations of children. Mr. High Commissioner, what activities could this Council undertake in order to facilitate a safe return of displaced children and other Ukrainian citizens? I thank you.
Thank you. Now let me invite Belarus.
Mr. President, we have noted the report of the Office of the High Commissioner on the situation in Ukraine. We note the need for a more systematic approach by the Office to such issues as incitement by the Ukrainian authorities to Russophobic hatred, repression of the Russian language and violation of the rights of believers of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and members of ethnic minorities. This not only sows discord between peoples but deepens hostility within the Ukrainian society itself. Only an impartial analysis without airbrushing or selectivity will make it possible to understand the range of reasons and factors that brought about this conflict and continue to fuel it, and develop recommendations that in the end can facilitate a sustainable long-term solution. Today it is the continuation of the armed conflict with active support from the Western states that is leading to violation of the fundamental right to life of civilians, Ukrainians and Russians. Real protection of human rights is impossible without restoral of peace. Thank you.
Delegation of Greece, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Greece aligns itself with the EU statement, welcomes the recent report of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and expresses profound concern for its findings. Once more, we condemn Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, which grossly violates international law and the UN Charter, and undermines international security and stability. We reiterate our support for the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The ongoing hostilities continue to inflict daily devastation upon civilians, leading to deaths, life-changing injuries, widespread suffering, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. We express concern over the lack of visible progress, as observed by OHCHR, in the investigation or prosecution of reported cases of killings, torture, and forced disappearances and arbitrary detention. We call for the respectful treatment, preservation of dignity, and protection of human rights of prisoners of war. We further deplore the inclusion of occupied regions in Russian military conscription efforts, which subjects young men to armed service against their own country, a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. Finally, we call for the OHCHR's fullest possible access to all areas of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation to facilitate comprehensive monitoring, which is critical to ensuring accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. Slovakia, please.
Thank you, President. Slovakia fully aligns with the EU statement. Mr. High Commissioner, we thank you very much for your update. The last report of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine confirms the continuation of serious impact of war, including far-reaching violations of human rights in IHL at Ukrainian territory. We once again want to reiterate Slovakia's resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter. We know the efforts of Ukrainian authorities to address the impact of war on the enjoyment of human rights, using also the advice of international bodies. We encourage Ukrainian authorities to make the wording and application of the relevant legislation in compliance with international standards, including IHL. Since the beginning of the conflict, the number of casualties were always reporting as being below reality. Meticulous work of Human Rights Monitoring Mission proves more and more cases and confirms the pattern of willful killings, arbitrary executions, torture, including sexual violence perpetrated by Russian armed forces. We equally condemn the practice of forced conscription of young men on occupied territories to Russian military, what is in blatant violation of Geneva Conventions. Slovakia calls again on the Russian Federation to allow for OHCHR's unrestricted access to all areas of Ukraine. We will continue to support the work of the OHCHR and the HRC mechanisms to monitor, investigate and document international crimes in Ukraine and support the efforts of the international community for accountability. I thank you, President.
Thank you. And now let me give the floor to the Czech delegation.
Thank you, Mr. President. High Commissioner, Czechia aligns itself with the EU statement and reaffirms our appreciation for your invaluable work and of the mission. As documented in the report, people in Ukraine continue to experience unspeakable suffering, displacement and destruction, leaving the most vulnerable at enormous risk. Russia fails to comply with its obligation under international humanitarian and human rights law. It fails to ensure the proper investigation of its international crimes. The recent arrest warrants by Russia against senior judges of the ICC are condemnable. Time and again, we urge for IHL to be fully respected at all times by all parties and for any of its perpetrators to be held accountable. All the recommendations of the Office and of Commission inquiry need to be implemented, including the immediate return of all forcibly transferred and deported children. We call on Russia to provide updated, comprehensive lists containing the names and whereabouts of all those children. Let us be clear that any attack intentionally targeting civilians is not only a grave breach of IHL, but also a tragic failure of humanity, whether in Ukraine or anywhere else in this world. As we approach the new year, our wish is for all children, for all humans, to live in peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Bulgaria, please.
Thank you, President. Bulgaria aligns with the EU statement. Let me thank the High Commissioner for his update on the latest developments related to human rights in Ukraine. As we just heard, the ongoing Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues to entail gross human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law, including willful killings, arbitrary detentions, torture, ill treatment of prisoners of war, illegal transfers and deportations of children. We are also outraged by the use of cluster munitions against civilians. Bulgaria has joined and supports the international coalition for the repatriation to Ukraine of illegally deported and forcibly displaced Ukrainian children and is committed to help Ukrainian children return to their homes. We believe that all officials and military personnel who are responsible for these gross violations of human rights and international humanitarian law must be held accountable. My country remains consistent in its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as for its European and Euro-Atlantic perspective. Bulgaria supports President Zelensky's peace formula and will work with Ukraine on the 10-point peace plan in view of generating the widest possible international engagement while respecting Ukraine's ownership over the initiative. High Commissioner, how can the international community further strengthen the efforts to more effectively address human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law, being committed in particular by the Russian armed forces and paramilitary formations in Ukraine? I thank you.
Thank you. New Zealand, please.
Mr. President, New Zealand thanks the High Commissioner for this intersessional update on the human rights situation in Ukraine. We strongly support continued focus on this situation. Russia's conduct over the last 22 months has only further underlined the necessity of ongoing close international scrutiny of the human rights situation. We are deeply concerned by the continued reports of human rights violations and war crimes in Ukraine, including willful killings, unlawful confinement, torture, rape and other sexual violence, and unlawful transfers and deportations of protected persons and children. We call for full respect of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and for the Russian Federation to allow OHCHR access to those areas of Ukraine under its occupation. Victims and survivors of human rights violations, including sexual violence, must be provided with the necessary support. Let us be clear. The dire human rights situation in Ukraine is a direct result of Russia's full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and its ongoing war of aggression. We strongly support efforts to ensure that all perpetrators of human rights violations are held fully accountable. We stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. High Commissioner, what more can be done to protect prisoners of war from torture, including sexual violence? I thank you.
Thank you. United States of America, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, High Commissioner, for your ongoing work and that of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission to bring Russia's atrocities to light with careful documentation and professional rigor. Since February 2022, Russia has forcibly transferred or deported Ukrainian children from occupied areas of Ukraine, including babies as young as 4 months old. These are crimes for which the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for President Putin. In the words of President Biden, we've all seen the brutality that Putin has inflicted on Ukraine, invading another country, trying to subjugate his neighbors to his iron rule, committing atrocities against Ukrainian civilians, trying to plunge them into the cold and darkness of winter by bombing their electrical grid. Russian forces are committing war crimes. It's as simple as that. Russia is the sole obstacle to peace in Ukraine, but the Kremlin has yet to demonstrate any meaningful interest in ending its war of aggression. Mr. President, we will continue standing in solidarity with Ukraine and remain absolutely committed to holding members of Russia's forces and other Russian officials accountable for their atrocities. Mr. High Commissioner, what steps has Russia taken to comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law to share information about and provide access to detained civilians? I thank you.
Thank you. Argentina, please.
Thank you, President. Argentina thanks the High Commissioner for the oral update. We recognise the importance of periodic reports by the Office of the High Commissioner based on the conclusions of the monitoring mission for a proper assessment of the human rights situation in Ukraine and the needs for technical assistance in Ukraine in the field of human rights. We strongly condemn all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law resulting from the Russian aggression against Ukraine. These must be investigated to ensure accountability for perpetrators, including both at the criminal level and the right of victims to truth, reparation and non-recurrence. We call on the Russian Federation fully to comply with its obligations under international law and immediately to end its aggression against Ukraine. In conclusion, we reiterate our strong commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, please.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. Venezuela has not supported the resolutions voted upon in the Council, which established which led to the establishment of these oral updates. The politicization and instrumentalization of human rights for different interests to their own protection promotion is noted. The agenda was created for cooperation, technical assistance and capacity building on human rights, with the participation of the concerned country and with genuine cooperation. This is fundamental in our work. It is regrettable that this important topic gives rise to these initiatives that seek to promote geopolitical ends, as under the former Human Rights Commission. We note the selectivity and the double standards. These do not contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights globally or bring any benefit to people or vulnerable groups. We uphold human rights which are indivisible, interdependent and interrelated, constructively without cooperation. We condemn the use of fora such as this agenda item for objects and goals which are different to those for which they are created. We must be transparent, objective and impartial, with full respect for the purposes and principles contained in the Charter.
This is Belgium. Belgium, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, la Belgique.
Thank you. Belgium thanks the High Commissioner for the update. In the report on the second year of the war against Ukraine, the monitoring mission has brought new evidence of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, including torture, rape, other sexual violence, deportation of Ukrainian children to the Russian Federation and others. Residential buildings, a station, restaurants, shops, a medical building have been targeted. In most cases, there was no military presence there or nearby. Approximately a quarter of the civilian victims have taken place far from the front line as a result of Russian missiles. Impunity continues. Last year, our call for accountability was made. We will repeat it again today. We reiterate our strong condemnation of all violations in the context of this war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. We call on Russia to stop completely, immediately, unconditionally this war. Thousands of Ukrainian children are missing, deported to Russia. What can the international community do to bring them back home? Thank you.
Merci à vous. Nicaragua is the next.
Thank you, President. The oral update that we have heard is politicized and biased. There needs to be impartiality, objectivity and non-selectivity with true cooperation and participation by the concerned country. The information provided does not reflect the human rights situation in Ukraine, particularly as regards freedom of expression, civil and political rights, religious rights, and rights of ethnic minorities. Our country condemns the racism in Ukraine, particularly Russophobia. Ukraine continues to kill civilians of vulnerable groups, striking the civilian infrastructure of Donbass. There needs to be proper international cooperation on an equal footing. We oppose manipulation of information, and this is all part of the geopolitical agenda of the Western countries against the friendly country of Russia. We reaffirm our unconditional support to the Russian Federation in building a new global order which is multipolar. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Turkey.
Mr. President, we move down the list towards the end, please. Thank you.
Russian Federation, please.
President, we fundamentally disagree with the methodology and content of yet another report of this type. We recall that the Office of the High Commissioner must report overall on the multiple human rights violations in Ukraine and not obsess over one specific aspect. We categorically reject the inclusion in the document of references to Crimea and the new Russian territories, regions. If we really want to speak about Donbass, we need to talk about the daily firing on Donetsk, the killing of children and other civilians by Ukrainian military forces. However, the office prefers not to do that, hypocritically whitewashing the crimes of the Kievan authorities. It does not speak of the systematic destruction in the country of freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, the persecution of the opposition, journalists, civilian activists. Where is the objective evidence about forced mobilization, including cases when in broad daylight people are snatched on the street and taken to unknown destinations? Where is the principled assessment of Zelensky's plan to cancel presidential elections and usurp the power in the country for good? We take note of the attempt, after our repeated reminders, to touch upon the violation of the rights of believers and ethnic minorities, but unfortunately it is only done to go through the motions. In seeking to exculpate Kiev, the office speaks only of separate legal aspects, ignoring the consistent attempts to eliminate in Ukraine the canonical orthodoxy, the elevation to the level of a state ideology of discrimination against ethnic minorities. We call on the office.
My list is Georgia. Georgia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the High Commissioner for today's update. Russia's indiscriminate attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure and on civilians continue. Among them, the deadliest recorded by the OHCHR in October 2023, injured and killed dozens of innocent civilians, including children in Kharkiv region. The periodic report depicts attacks on schools and hospitals, having particular negative impacts for children and causing disruption of essential healthcare services. Latest atrocities continue to illustrate the systematic and flagrant violations of international human rights and humanitarian law committed by Russia, some of which amount to war crimes. I would like to once again underline the importance of accountability for such serious crimes. We reiterate our call on Russia to comply with the provisional measures of the ICJ of the 16th March 2022, immediately cease the aggression, completely and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the whole territory of Ukraine. As the main sponsor of the UNGA resolution on principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, Georgia reiterates its support to the Peace Formula initiative and joint efforts of the international community. In conclusion, we reaffirm Georgia's unwavering support to independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now let me invite Cyprus.
Mr. President, Cyprus aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his report and today's presentation. One of the key takeaways of the Human Rights 75 initiative held earlier this month is that we benefit from a strong global constituency for human rights and international principles, and that we should focus on their implementation. Yet, in the context of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, principles such as the territorial integrity and sovereign equality of independent states have been severely violated. Cyprus fully supports the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Mission in Ukraine and the recommendations outlined in its latest report. We condemn the documented violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, including instances of forced conscription of young men, forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children, arbitrary detention and torture of civilians in the occupied territory, summary executions and continuous targeting of civilian infrastructure. We remain steadfast in our commitment to ensuring accountability for the crimes committed and to holding perpetrators accountable. We call on Russia to stop its aggression immediately and without preconditions and to comply with its international obligations under the UN Charter. Cyprus reiterates its support to the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states and expresses solidarity to the government and people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, President. Unfortunately, instead of discussing the situation of human rights in Ukraine, we find ourselves yet again faced with an attempt to manipulate the Council by certain countries in order to target other countries and demonize them. The oral update and the discussion we heard today reflect only the level of hypocrisy and manipulation by these countries in the field of human rights. It further exacerbates crises and tensions and destabilizes the world. We condemn violations of human rights by Ukrainian authorities, which include torture, killing, forced disappearances, discrimination, and oppression of voice critical of its policies, particularly violations of Russian language-speaking people, and we call for the immediate end. We stress the need to put an end to this politicized approach imposed by Western countries on the Council, which prevents the Council from attaining its goal and discharging its mandate. We underscore also the need to deal with human rights issues in line with the principles of neutrality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. And thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Albania, please.
Mr. President, Albania thanks the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the updated and reiterates its full support to the work of the Nation Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine continues to generate drastic and far-reaching violation of human rights with long-lasting ramification which severely undermines the global peace and security. As the High Commissioner underlines in his remarks from 1st August until the end of November 2023, the Office of High Commissioner has documented more than 2,440 civilian casualties, particularly in some regions near to the front line, but also far from the front line. The report about the situation of human rights in Ukraine repleted with conflict-related sexual violence, damage of civilian medical and education facilities, movement and reallocation of civilians, mistreatment of prisoners of war, killing, torture, arbitrary detention, etc. The attack of Russian forces on the grain-related facilities in the territory under the control of Ukraine remains a source of concern for the food security in many countries in the world. We demand the Russian authority to stop using of the explosive weapon with wide affected populated areas, to investigate effectively all the allegations of human rights violation, to stop immediately targeting civilian infrastructure and the practice of arbitrary detention and torture of civilians, to ensure the proper return of all deported individuals, including children and disabled persons. Finally, Albania believes that the respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders remain the only way to reach a just and...
delegation of Israel. Israel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, High Commissioner, for the oral update. Israel would like to reiterate its stance regarding Russia's attack on Ukraine, an action that undermines the foundations of the international order. Israel continues to be resolute in its support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. As a country who has just suffered from a brutal attack and acts of savagery in the past few months, Israel remains concerned over reports of attacks carried out against civilians in Ukraine, including reports of torture and sexual and gender-based violence. Mr. President, despite fighting a war at home, Israel will continue to provide assistance abroad, including to the Ukrainian people. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to the Ukrainian people for their steadfast support during our challenging times and commend the resolute statements of their leaders. As the festival of Hanukkah concluded over the weekend, let us draw inspiration from the enduring symbolism of light overcoming darkness. May both our nations soon emerge from the shadows with a beacon of hope and hope illuminating our path towards peace and prosperity. I thank you.
Thank you. The Kingdom of the Netherlands, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. High Commissioner, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We remain deeply concerned by the continuous and large-scale human rights violations perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine. We express our appreciation to OHCHR for its essential work performed in Ukraine and for bringing these issues to light. Once again, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine's report details the daily destruction inflicted by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Once again, the report highlights the civilian lives lost and the widespread suffering they are made to endure. Once again, the blatant disregard for international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation is laid bare for the whole world to see. We condemn Russia in the strongest possible terms for these acts and their war of aggression against Ukraine. We reaffirm our full solidarity with Ukraine and its courageous people in the defense of their country, and we express our unwavering commitment to the independence, sovereignty, and respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
Thank you. Germany, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. And we would like to thank the High Commissioner for his update and the monitoring mission for its tireless work under the most challenging circumstances. Let me assure you that politically and financially, Germany remains a steadfast supporter of the mission. Ukraine is entering the second winter since Russia launched its war of aggression. The effects, political, economic and social, are felt around the world, but mostly by the Ukrainians. Russia has been violating the UN Charter and has undermined the most fundamental principles of international law and international relations ever since. It has been violating the human rights of Ukrainians brutally and systematically, in particular those of the most vulnerable ones. President Putin has made clear that he has no intention of stopping his war of aggression. And when Russia presented its new candidature to the Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly sent a strong signal. There is no place for Russia on this council. And our reaction should continue to be crystal clear. We stand up against Russia's aggression and we support Ukraine. We stand in solidarity with Ukraine, a member of the European family, as long as it takes. The European Council has been very clear in this regard, deciding to open accession negotiations with Ukraine. And the only way to stop the systematic human rights violations in Ukraine committed by Russia is for Russia to end its war of aggression now. Thank you.
Thank you. Liechtenstein, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liechtenstein thanks the High Commissioner for his oral update on the situation in Ukraine. The report paints a grim picture of the ongoing severe and far-reaching violations of human rights and international humanitarian law as a result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Almost 2 years into the war, civilians and civilian infrastructure remain one of the main targets of missiles launched by the Russian armed forces, as demonstrated by the high numbers of civilian casualties, as well as the damaging or destruction of 83 educational and 20 healthcare establishments during the reporting period. Mr. President, it is clear that the aggression against Ukraine cannot be unpunished. Liechtenstein, together with like-minded partner countries, will continue to work on avenues to ensure justice and accountability, including by supporting the creation of a special tribunal on the crime of aggression. Accountability for the crime of aggression, which is a leadership crime, is a crucial element of ensuring respect for the international legal order. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. Romania, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, High Commissioner, for your update. Romania aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU and deplores the consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, crushing the civilian population's rights to education, health, housing, food, an increasing number of deaths, as the monitoring mission in Ukraine reports. Romania specifically condemns the crimes committed by Russia within occupied Ukrainian territories, among which the application of Russian judicial and administrative systems, so-called elections, imposing Russian legislation and judiciary, forced conscription. Russia must cooperate in monitoring human rights violations and must submit to the public international debate the results of the investigations launched regarding the violations of international law committed by its own forces. There can be no legitimate accountability in the absence of public and transparent investigative procedural rules. An open and honest dialogue with the office and allowing access of international monitoring mechanisms to war zones and occupied territories is crucial. Romania is highly concerned about the effects of the war on the rights of persons in vulnerable situations. To this end, High Commissioner, we would like to ask you, what measures do you consider urgent to be taken to ensure the protection of forcibly displaced or deported persons, women, children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly in war zones and occupied territories under current circumstances? I thank you.
Thank you. Ireland is the next speaker.
Thank you. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the High Commissioner for his update. Ireland reaffirms our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognised borders. We are concerned by the findings of the most recent report by your office, which affirm that Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues to generate severe human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. We deplore the widespread harm to civilians, the brutality of Russia's aggression and disregard for international humanitarian law has been characterized by a pattern of attacks on populated areas, resulting in multiple civilian casualties and significant damage to civilian property and infrastructure, including grain, educational and healthcare facilities. We are deeply concerned that landmines and explosive remnants of war continue to be a cause of civilian casualties, particularly in the Kharkiv, Donetsk and Kherson oblasts. These indiscriminate weapons continue to inflict devastating humanitarian harm and undermine long-term stability, and as you have noted today, threaten the lives, rights and livelihoods of Ukrainians in both the immediate and long term. As the full scale of Russia's violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law becomes more apparent, the international community must continue to work for justice and accountability for the victims and survivors. High Commissioner, what role should the international community play in enhancing capacity for safe, efficient and effective demining operations? Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Canada.
Mr. President,
and thank you, High Commissioner, for your update and ongoing monitoring of Russia's unlawful aggression against Ukraine, which continues to inflict suffering on the Ukrainian people. Russia has flagrantly continued attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, illegal arrests, torture of dissidents, conflict-related sexual violence, while attempting to legitimize their violations by imposing Russian legal systems and coercing conscription in occupied areas. These are but a few of the many violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Russia must be held accountable for these horrific acts. Ensuring the safe return of Ukraine's children to their families is particularly important. Previously, you have updated this Council on the exceptional cruelty of illegal and forcible deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia for the purpose of clandestine adoptions or to be subjected to re-education camps. Even more insidious is Russia's attempt to whitewash unlawful actions by presenting them as part of a humanitarian effort at protecting children from war and as a normal element of Russia's child welfare system. What is clear is that children's rights must come before the realities of war. Canada is committed to working with Ukraine on the international initiative for the return of Ukrainian children to ease barriers of a safe return of children to their families. I thank you.
Thank you. Delegation of Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan expresses its appreciation for the update provided by the High Commissioner and the continued efforts by his office to address the human rights situation in Ukraine. Japan is deeply alarmed that in a 4-month period between August and November 2023, OHCHR reported 2,440 civilian casualties. Japan also remains deeply concerned by reports that Russian armed forces are committing violating of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Ukraine, including attacks on civilian infrastructures. We cannot condone any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force. Russia must withdraw immediately and unconditionally from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine and fulfill its obligations under international human rights law and humanitarian law. Japan remains steadfast in its support for Ukraine and its people and will continue to coordinate with the international community to provide strong support for Ukraine to realize a just and lasting peace in Ukraine as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Spain, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Spain aligns itself with the statement made by the EU. We'd like to thank the High Commissioner's Office for his work, and we welcome the recommendations from the monitoring mission in Ukraine. Its work is key for documenting human rights violations. We firmly condemn Russia's armed aggression in Ukraine, which continues to cause terrible suffering for the civilian population. It costs lives, wounds people, triggers sexual and gender-based violence, arbitrary detention, torture, and forced displacement, including of children. To this, you have to add the loss of homes and livelihoods, the destruction of infrastructure, deprivation of basic services, and an impact on global energy and food security. Flagrant violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law should be duly investigated, and there must be accountability in order to preserve truth, justice, and provide reparation to victims. We reaffirm our support to the Ukrainian people in their defence for peace, freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last country on my list is Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for the update. We took note of the findings of the report. We have also noted the statements by the previous speakers before us. As we have said on previous occasions, international humanitarian law and human rights law must be respected. Allegations of all violations of international law should be investigated, and perpetrators must be held to account. Now, we also have a new factor. We cannot safeguard civilians and international law with regard to Ukraine more than we do so in Gaza. I thank you.
Thank you. We will now continue with the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. And we will start with 2 video statements, first by International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute and the Ukrainian Bar Association condemn escalating violations of human rights and international humanitarian law amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity in the course of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, also confirmed by the latest oral updates of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. We condemn the widespread and systematic murder, torture, incommunicado detention, enforced disappearances and sexual violence in territories occupied by Russian armed forces, as also indicated in the Commission of Inquiry's findings, and we are alarmed by the signs of genocide and ecocide in Ukraine. We remain seriously concerned about the status and treatment of all Ukrainian children forcibly transferred and deported to the temporarily occupied territories and Russia. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease those practices and collaborate with Ukraine and international actors to ensure the children's safe return to Ukraine. We also call on United Nations institutions and member states through international cooperation to enhance accountability by means of universal jurisdiction, as well as provide robust support to the Ukraine's justice system and assist in effective investigation and prosecution of international crimes in accordance with fair trial guarantees. Thank you.
And the second video will be delivered by the International Federation for Human Rights Leaks.
The International Federation for Human Rights wishes to thank the High Commissioner for his update and for his important work on the human rights situation in Ukraine. Regular updates remain vital as Ukrainians brace amid Russia's escalating attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure for the second winter since Russia's full-scale invasion. The situation remains particularly dire in the Russian-occupied territories, where Russian authorities continue to commit mass violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. This includes the unlawful detention and torture of civilians, the prosecution of Ukrainian POWs for terrorism-related charges, the persecution of all those showing their allegiance to the Ukrainian state, and subjecting those who wish to leave the occupied territories to invasive filtration practices. An indoctrination campaign has also been put in place, including in schools, where Ukrainian teachers must abide by a new curriculum and use Russian textbooks, which claim that Ukraine is an ultra-nationalist state and that any dissent in Ukraine is severely persecuted. The opposition is banned. This type of an accusation in the mirror forms part of Russia's propaganda of hate, actively disseminated by state media. FIDH considers that hate speech in itself may amount to the crime against humanity of persecution, a crime falling under the jurisdiction of the ICC. Against this backdrop, FIDH calls on all UN member states to further strengthen their cooperation with the existing investigation and accountability mechanisms for Ukraine, and to ensure effective criminal accountability for all perpetrators of international crimes. I thank you.
Thank you. Now, in-person intervention by Human Rights House Foundation, please.
The Monitoring Mission's quarterly report provides excruciating detail of the ongoing campaign of arbitrary detention and torture committed by Russian authorities in the context of their war against Ukraine. We continue to bring to the Council's attention the cases of all unjustly detained or imprisoned in Crimea. As of last month, Zmina Human Rights Center reported 186 political prisoners from occupied Crimea. The treatment of human rights defenders in detention, including the denial of access to adequate medical care in detention facilities, remains deeply concerning. We remind the Council of the case of journalist Irina Danilovich, arbitrarily detained since April 2022 and in need of urgent medical care. She complained of significant pain in her left ear and was told by a penal colony doctor that, quote, "the pain will go away when you're deaf." She has since lost hearing in her left ear and possibly suffered a microstroke while in detention. Her medication has been confiscated and she is denied access to medical care. Amain Hussein Kuku, a Crimean Tatar human rights defender whose situation we have raised several times at this Council, is not receiving regular medical examinations nor a proper diet following intestinal surgery while in detention. Independent journalist Vladislav Yesipenko has experienced significant vision and blood pressure related medical issues as a result of torture while in detention. President, we ask the High Commissioner what challenges OHCHR continues to face in accessing Ukrainian civilians held in places of detention, and what ongoing steps are being taken to address those challenges. I thank you.
Thank you. And because of the technical difficulties, we will see again the video statement delivered by International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute and the Ukrainian Bar Association condemn escalating violations of human rights and international humanitarian law amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity in the course of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, also confirmed by the latest oral updates of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. We condemn the widespread and systematic murder, torture, incommunicado detention, enforced disappearances and sexual violence in territories occupied by Russian armed forces, as also indicated in the Commission of Inquiry's findings, and we are alarmed by the signs of genocide and ecocide in Ukraine. We remain seriously concerned about the status and treatment of all Ukrainian children forcibly transferred and deported to the temporarily occupied territories and Russia. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease those practices and collaborate with Ukraine and international actors to ensure the children's safe return to Ukraine. We also call on United Nations institutions and member states through international cooperation to enhance accountability by means of universal jurisdiction, as well as provide robust support to the Ukraine's justice system and assist in effective investigation and prosecution of international crimes in accordance with fair trial guarantees. Thank you.
And now I would like to invite the High Commissioner to respond to the questions made and to make his concluding remarks. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you also to all delegations for participating in this international meeting on Ukraine, on the human rights situation in Ukraine. And it is absolutely clear that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine continues to inflict untold suffering on the people of Ukraine with profound global implications. And it's also very clear that the right to peace must be realized and that the war must end in line with the UN Charter and international law. There were a number of questions around certain themes, so I will go through these themes and answer them. There was a lot of questions actually on accountability and serving justice, and we know that in many conflict situations around the world, accountability is always the missing link. So it is clear that accountability has to be a priority, and the accountability and justice, in particular for victims of human rights violations. So it's also, I mean, the overarching message is that all efforts to promote accountability for all violations, wherever and whenever committed through fair and independent investigations and prosecutions consistent with international law, are important and welcome. The investigations of the International Criminal Court and the UN Commission of Inquiry are key elements in this process and obviously deserve full international support, as do national efforts by Ukraine. And I had a chance when I visited last year to talk to the Prosecutor General, to the Ombudsperson and the different institutions in Ukraine. They have received a number of allegations that go into the tens of thousands, and they really require substantial support, and particularly support on the forensic side, support also to continued technical assistance in these areas to strengthen the prosecution efforts, the documentation efforts, but also strengthening the country's judicial system. I think it's also important, we talk always about victim-centered approach, and I know that the government is working on to establish accessible programs of reparation and assistance for victims, and it's important to do it without awaiting the outcome of the judicial process. And so we hope very much there is more support for Ukraine in developing and implementing these programs, and supporting both state bodies and civil society organizations that provide assistance to victims and their families, because we know how important this victim-centered approach is, and they obviously need to be heard in the development and design of these programs. The other area, the other theme that came out quite clearly is the protection of prisoners of war. As you know, my office released a report on the treatment of prisoners of war in March 2023, and we know that the situation of Ukrainian prisoners of war in the hands of the Russian Federation remains extremely preoccupying. We have full confidential access to Russian prisoners of war in Ukraine, but we don't have access to Ukrainian prisoners of war that are held by the Russian Federation, including in the occupied territory of Ukraine. We have documented widespread torture and ill treatment of Ukrainian POWs, including sexual violence. So it is absolutely critical that training, clear instructions are provided to armed forces on the basic principles of IHL, and that there is independent and impartial monitoring and full access to places of internment for Ukrainian POWs. And I really urge the Russian Federation to respect the rights of Ukrainian POWs so that they are also able to communicate with their families and show empathy for the suffering of their relatives who have often not received letters or messages from their loved ones for more than a year. In August 2023, Ukraine initiated the formation of a mixed medical commission that would facilitate the return of seriously wounded Russian POWs. Unfortunately, the Russian Federation has not yet approved the composition of the mixed medical commission that would work in Ukraine, nor has it initiated the creation of a similar commission to work in the Russian Federation. I believe that mixed medical commissions, as provided for in the Geneva Conventions, would ease the suffering of prisoners of war and ensure better treatment and recovery. So we really call on the international community, on the Russian Federation, to facilitate the establishment of mixed medical commissions and provide the parties to the conflict with the support that may be needed for such commissions to become effective. I also encourage the international community to support assistance programs for victims and survivors of sexual violence, including male survivors of sexual violence. There was a question around the documentation of violations in occupied territory. As you know, my office has increased its monitoring of the human rights situation in occupied territory, where Russian authorities continue to unlawfully consolidate administrative systems. They held unlawful elections in September 2023, established courts, and began conscripting local men into Russian armed forces. We monitor this situation remotely, but also through regular fact-finding missions to areas under government control. And these findings are based on direct interviews with victims and witnesses and persons who have recently traveled from occupied territory to government-controlled parts of Ukraine are obviously a very important source of information about life under the Russian occupation. But it's clear that pressing for unimpeded access to all areas of Ukraine is key to facilitate the comprehensive documentation of violations in occupied territory, which also means continued support to my office's presence in the country and to the monitoring mission in particular. On civilian detainees, because there was a couple of questions on that, I am deeply concerned by the large number of civilian detainees detained by the Russian Federation. And I recall that my office has documented the widespread use of torture of Ukrainian civilian detainees and POWs by the Russian authorities. So it's key that there is pressing by the international community, but also to the Russian Federation, to provide my office, but also other independent monitors, access to Ukrainian detainees. And I also would like to highlight in particular the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross. I think it's important to make sure that there is also support for national institutions, civil society organizations that provide psychosocial support and other forms of assistance to release detainees and the families who remain detained or missing. On the issue of forced transfer and deportations, in particular of children, the lack of access to the occupied territory of Ukraine and the Russian Federation makes it very difficult to verify all allegations and assess the scale of transfers and of forced transfers and deportation. What we have been able to document so far are 8 situations in which about 200 children from Donetsk, Kherson, Kharkiv and Kiev regions were transferred to the regions in occupied territory or to the Russian Federation. The international community needs to urge the Russian Federation to give OHCHR and other international organizations full and unfettered access to unaccompanied and separated children from Ukraine. We need to have detailed information on these children. They need to be this information has to be shared with the relevant bodies that are designated under international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and we need also to ensure that it's also important that there is a dialogue that needs to be facilitated between Ukraine and the Russian Federation to establish a functioning mechanism to identify these children, trace their family links, and of course it's important to ensure funding and support for governmental and non-governmental organizations that offer and that have done work on the legal side, on the logistical side, psychological and vital services for children. I note that states have a positive obligation to ensure that children affected by family separation have access to effective, expeditious and child-friendly family reunification procedures. These children have a right to be heard, and we need to ensure that their best interests are taken into account in all considerations that affect them. I urge the Russian Federation to adhere to the prohibition on changing the personal status of these children, including their nationality, and to ensure that no adoptions of children separated from their parents take place during and immediately after the international armed conflict. When it comes to people in situations of vulnerability in the occupied territory, just to say that in occupied territory, the mass conferral of Russian citizenship conducted in a coercive environment results in people without Russian passports risking losing access to public services or experiencing restrictions on their freedom of movement. And it is important for the Russian Federation, and I urge the Russian Federation to respect in full, as I said during my statement, applicable international humanitarian law in the territory under its occupation, which means also in particular the ending of conscription of protected persons and delinking access to essential services and work from the obtention of Russian passports. There was also a question about demining. As I said also during my statement, it's important to rigorously map the location of mines during active hostilities so that these areas can be promptly cleared in line with the protocol on prohibitions or restrictions on the use of mines, booby traps and other devices. And we ask the international community to assist Ukraine in enhancing its capacity for safe, efficient and effective demining operations and support programs to educate civilians to the risks posed by mines and other explosive weapons, particularly in areas over which Ukraine has regained control. And now I've finished the Ukraine part of this international meeting, and if you allow me, I'd like to take the opportunity to say 3 things. I would like to first of all pay tribute to you as the President of the Council for having steered us through a very intense phase of the Human Rights Council. I think we have never had so many weeks of meetings, including intersessional meetings, so I really want to pay tribute to you and to your team for having steered us through this year. Et j'aimerais bien aussi exprimer ma reconnaissance.
I would also like to express deep gratitude to my colleague Eric Chistounet and I did not have the opportunity to do that during the organisational session, but I want to thank him for everything he's done for us and for the Council. You're going to miss us, that's a fact. But I know that you'll still be here. But really, we thank you for this part of your life that you have dedicated to the Council and to human rights. On behalf of all of my colleagues, we are profoundly grateful.
Since the festive season is coming up, I would like to obviously wish you all the very best, my warmest personal regards and wishes, and really more peace and light for 2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner, for your comprehensive presentation today, but let me thank you also personally for our excellent cooperation throughout the year and for the support I was getting from the OHCHR and all your people. Colleagues, this is probably the last formal meeting of the Council, so let me seize the opportunity and let me wish you all happy holidays and all the best in 2024. And with this, I'm closing the interactive dialogue on the oral update by the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Ukraine. And I wish you a good day and a good rest of the year and then the year after. Thank you.
Recording stopped.